So one of the most confusing parts of building cabinets isn't building the cabinet boxes themselves, it's building the doors and drawer fronts. What's the right way to build them? How do you get the hinges that you need? And maybe the biggest mystery of all is, how do you build the right size door to get the look that you're going for?
I have no idea.
But in this video, I'm going to break all that down step by step in as simple terms as possible so you can build your cabinet doors with confidence. The first style, and what I would consider the absolute beginner level, is the slab door. This is a very popular style found in everything from IKEA furniture to mid-century modern pieces, but it's also a very utilitarian door, great for things like shop cabinets and garage storage. And these are usually made from some type of composite wood product like MDF or plywood. While it's possible to use solid wood, it's not really recommended due to the likelihood of the door becoming a potato chip with changes in temperature and humidity. And that likelihood goes up the larger the door gets, so I just avoid that altogether. So to cut your slab door, you can use pretty much any saw. Something as basic as a jigsaw combined with a straight edge will get the job done. But I prefer to use my track saw whenever I cut sheet goods because, well, I'm not a beginner anymore. I've been doing this for 10 years. But if you'd like to fake it until you make it, just swap this out with a circular saw and use it with that straight edge. You are going to need to do some math here and subtract the distance from the edge of your saw to the blade, and that's going to let you know how far to offset your straight edge. And a great way to attach your straight edge to your workpiece is to use two-sided tape. It's very secure and you won't have any clamps getting in the way of your saw. Two-sided tape is something like a super tool in my shop. I have dozens of different uses for it and I always have it around. And you know, while I'm cutting this, I'll go ahead and give you 3 tips that'll take you from a level 1 DIYer to like a level 10 DIYer immediately. Tip number 1 is to always start by trimming off the factory edges of any sheet goods. Getting these sheets from the factory to the big box store is a long journey, and by the time they end up in your shop, these edges are all torn up. You always want crisp, clean edges on any cabinet part, so trim those edges off before making any other cuts. And for tip number 2, no matter how basic the saw is that you're using, make sure that the blade that's on it is rated for fine finish cuts on sheet goods. These blades will have a higher tooth count and different tooth geometry designed for leaving smooth, chip-out free cuts on these materials. The blades that come with these saws are almost always for general use in construction, and nothing is going to make your project look like a DIY hack job faster than using the wrong blade. And tip number 3 is to upgrade that straight edge by making a jig like this, which turns your circular saw into a track saw. Well, sort of. Your saw is going to run along this edge to keep it moving in a straight line, and you don't need that offset math like before because this edge is the cutting edge. So just put your jig right on the layout line and be on your merry way. And before you know it, you'll have your door cut out with nice, crispy edges. One thing you're going to want to do is check your door for a square, and that's easy enough to do. If you have a square, just set it on all 4 corners. Make sure there's no gaps or light showing through, and you're good to go. But if you don't have a square, you can do the same thing with a tape measure. And just measure from one corner to the opposite corner, if I can get it hooked. Take that measurement, and then go from the other side like this. And ideally, you want those 2 numbers to equal. And if that's true, your door is perfectly square. Realistically, though, if you're within a 32nd of an inch, that's more than good enough, and it is not worth chasing perfection. And if your door is made of MDF, congratulations, you're done, and you can move on to the finishing step. But if you made it out of plywood, there's one other step that I recommend. To give your door a finished look, you should absolutely cover up these plywood edges. Even if you're going to paint the door, this is going to show right through the paint job. The good news is there's a very beginner-friendly solution, and that's to grab a roll of iron-on edge banding. And these are by no means necessary, but this is a rundown of the tools that I use to make this a snap. Number 1, of course, is an iron. Most people already have that one. They make this edge banding in all common wood species, so you can match your plywood pretty easily, and it's really easy to apply. It just takes a few swipes of the iron to melt the glue. Then there's this pressure roller, which just makes sure that once your edge banding is on there, that its bond is tight. Then you can use this flush trim cutter, which snips the ends of the edge banding and nice and clean. And to get those long edges cleaned up, you can just use one of these quad trimmers. This thing is so satisfying to use when you get those long curls coming off the edges. And finally, I would say this is the least necessary, but they do make this edge sanding tool that breaks the sharp edges and makes everything nice and smooth. And there you go. You have yourself a nice looking slab door. One step up from the slab door is one of the most popular styles today, and that's the shaker style or frame and panel door. It's got 2 rails and 2 stiles which make up the frame, and that gives the door its structure. And then there's a panel that floats in the center of that frame. It gives it a pretty clean and simple look, but a little more visually interesting than the slab, and it allows us to start using solid wood. Okay, time out. Let's talk about solid wood options for a minute. Some common wood species you might choose from are pine, poplar, and maple. I also have oak in here, but for this chat, just consider these two the same. You can get any of these at the big box store already milled up, so you don't need a planer or joiner. These are very beginner friendly. In terms of cost, pine's going to be your cheapest option. Poplar is about 50% more than pine, and these guys are going to be more than double the cost of pine. Along with being the cheapest option, pine is also the softest, followed by poplar, and then these guys are very tough and dense. All of these can be painted, but these look the best naturally. So what to choose? Well, in a high-traffic kitchen area with a natural look, you want to go with one of these. And if you're looking for a more budget-friendly option where the cabinets are going to be painted, you can try poplar. And for low-use utility cabinets, or if you don't want to spend a lot of money on an example for a YouTube video, go with pine. So now that we're cutting door parts and dealing with joinery, we need to up our tool game. And to be sure, there's lots of different ways to make a door like this, and your list of tools could grow a lot. You could use a miter saw to cut your frame parts, a router table to cut the grooves, and any number of tools to cut joinery for the frame. But I could show you how to build this door using just a table saw. And nope, not this really expensive cabinet saw. This saw. First, I'm going to cut my parts to length, and I took the saw's miter gauge and added a scrap of plywood to act as a fence to back up my crosscuts. I just marked my cut on this 1x3 and cut to the line. And remember the tip I gave you earlier about using the right saw blade. This is an 80-tooth blade meant for cross-cutting his sheet goods. And here's another pro tip. After you cut your first piece, just hold it against the blade and add a stop block to the fence. I did this using two-sided tape, but you could use a small clamp if you want. Now cut the matching rail or stile using the stop block, and you're guaranteed to have two parts that are going to be the exact same length. Anytime you're cutting multiples of the same part, you don't need to measure and mark each one, just the first one. This is how we work faster and smarter. And for the center panel, I bought a 2-foot by 4-foot piece of 1/4-inch MDF. And I cut that to size using the same 80-tooth blade. By the way, if you're wondering what the dimensions should be for all these parts, don't worry about that stuff now. I'm saving all the mathy bits for later in the video. And for those of you who own this saw or you have a keen eye, you may notice that I made another modification to the saw. TSO makes a fence upgrade that gives you the ability to fasten things like featherboards, hold downs, and other jigs, which just increases the utility of a job site saw like this. And here's another tip. If you want a more robust door panel, use 1/2-inch MDF instead. You just need to cut a rabbet all around all 4 sides. The TSO fence upgrade makes this easy too, because I can attach something like a sacrificial fence and then I can bury my dado stack into it to make these rabbets. By the way, the fact that this job site saw can take a dado stack is a really nice feature. I don't think you see that on all these smaller saws. And allow me to jump ahead in the video for a few seconds and show you that this panel is going to drop into the grooves of the frame, and the back of the panel is now going to be flush with the back of the frame. And this is really important when you're making drawer fronts, because you want the back to be perfectly flat so that it can attach to the drawer box when you install it. But even if you're just making a door, it's a little more sturdy and it removes any chance of rattle. Okay, now hopping back to the present, I need to cut those grooves in all my frame parts, and to do that, I need to make a blade change. So where the 80-tooth blade shines at cross-cutting, we need a ripping blade to make these cuts because it has a flat tooth geometry. This is going to make the bottom of the groove perfectly flat with no little bad ears, and you're going to see why that matters in just a bit. I want the groove to be at least 1/2 inch deep, so I'm going to set my blade height to 1/2 inch and then make my first cut near the center of the workpiece. Then I'm going to flip it around end for end and run it through again, and this is going to make sure that I perfectly center that groove on the workpiece. So my center panel is 1/4 inch thick, and this groove most definitely is not yet. So to dial this in perfectly, I'm going to adjust my fence away from the blade just slightly and then run this through again. Then just check to see if the panel fits. Mine does. If yours doesn't, just repeat that process again until you get a nice snug fit, because we don't want the panel to rattle around in the door. And once I had that dialed in exactly where I want it, I can go ahead and run all my other frame parts. Hopefully this is a theme that you're picking up in this video. Always use one part or a test piece to dial in the perfect cuts, and then you can run all your parts through quickly and accurately without having to adjust the setup every time. Alright, with the grooves all cut, I need to make the tongues on the end of each rail. To do that, I set the height of the blade just below the height of the groove. Then since these grooves are 1/2 inch deep, I need to set the fence so that the outside of my saw blade is 1/2 inch from the fence. I'm using my miter gauge again to nibble away at that material until I reach the fence. Then I can flip it over and repeat that on the opposite face. Now when I try to put this together, it should not go, and that's great. That's how I planned it. Never try to nail this cut on the first pass because you could easily overshoot your mark and end up making this joint really loose, sometimes so loose that it's not even usable anymore. Allow yourself to sneak up on the perfect fit by raising the blade just a tiny amount each time, making that pass, and then retrying the fit. And like I said early in the video, dial this in on your first piece. Once you get it fitting perfectly, then go back and cut the rest of your joints. Work smarter, people, not harder. A good fit means that you can put the joint together with little to no effort and you can pick it up and it doesn't fall apart. Okay, with all the parts cut, I just slide the center panel into one of the stiles, then add glue to each of the tongues and slide them into the grooves over the center panel. Then grab the other stile and tap it into place. Before you add your clamps here, you can check the panel for square, but really the way these joints are cut, the door should pretty much square itself with a little clamping pressure. After the glue cures, just pop your door out of the clamps and sand all the joints flush and give everything a good sanding up to about 180 grit. And you can see here on the top and bottom of the door that joint is visible, which is why you need to use a flat grind tooth to make those grooves so you get a nice clean looking joint. So this door looks awesome, and that shaker style really goes well in any application where you're looking for that clean, simple look. But sometimes you want to take this basic design to the next level by giving it a lot more visual detail. You know, class it up a little bit. So for the final pro level, I'll take the frame and panel door and turn it into a raised panel door. This just means the center panel is raised out of the frame and has this deep profile cut all the way around it, and the frame parts also have this small chamfer detail cut all the way around the inside edge. This just gives the door much more depth and visual interest. Unlike the previous two examples, this door is going to be made out of 100% solid wood, including that center panel, which means we have a new problem to solve for and a new set of tools to use. Cutting all the blanks for the frame parts is exactly the same as the previous examples, just using the table saw, but that center panel is different. Instead of using a 1/4 inch MDF panel, I'm using a full 3/4 inch solid wood panel. Depending on how wide your door is, you're probably going to have to glue up multiple boards to make this panel, which just means there's going to be an extra step and waiting for that glue to dry. And once the glue is dry, I'm just going to run it through the planer a couple of times. That's just going to clean up the seams and give me one solid panel. And here's where I'm really going to divert from that plain shaker door, because for this one, I'm going to cut all the joinery and the details using a router table and this set of bits. These two bits are going to cut the grooves as well as the tongues on the end of each rail, and this big beast is going to hog away all that material to give us that raised center panel. I always like to start by cutting the tongues first. I marked 2 lines on the center of the workpiece 1/4 inch apart, and then I lined up the bits so that the cutters are just above and below these lines. And a big tip here is make sure that you back up this cut with a scrap of plywood, MDF, or whatever. Otherwise, the bit's going to cause a lot of tear out as it exits the wood. And we're going to use this bit to create the tongues on the ends of each side of each rail. Notice how this isn't a square cut like in the previous example. This is called a coped cut, and I'll show you why that's important in just a minute. But first, I need to make a bit change because I need to go to the second bit so that I can cut the grooves in all the frame parts. One of the reasons that I like to start by cutting my tongues first is because now I can use that tongue to set the exact height of this bit, and then I can go ahead and run the grooves along each of my 4 frame parts. Alright, so let me show you the mistake that I just made. Because I was so busy focusing on camera angles and filming this for you, I wasn't paying attention to grain direction. I cut against the grain and got a big bunch of tear out on this. Now, if this wasn't just an example door made for a YouTube video, I'd have to throw this away and cut this part all over again. So please pay attention to grain direction, and that's going to greatly reduce your chance of getting tear out like this. Now you can see how these two parts come together, and the tongue and the groove work exactly like they did before, but see how the rail overlaps now? And this little chamfer detail was also cut on the inside, and all this combined is called coping, and it's what makes that router bit set so worth it for making really nice looking doors. Well, that and getting to use this. This bit will cut the profile in the center panel that gives it that raised panel look, and there's a couple of things to remember when using it. First of all, this is a massive router bit. Don't try to make this cut all in one pass. In fact, I'm not sure my 3 horsepower router could even do that without stalling out the motor. I generally like to make this cut in 3 passes. The first 2 cuts clear away the majority of the waste, and that last pass is really more of a skim cut to remove any of the burn marks that the first 2 cuts may have caused. See? Not a burn mark anywhere. Before I glue this door up, I said there was a problem I needed to solve for. Because this panel is solid wood, it will expand and contract, mainly in this direction, so do not glue this into the frame. The most you can get away with is adding a dab of glue here near the center at the top and the bottom, and that will keep the panel from rattling. Or you can use Spaceballs.
I can't breathe in this thing.
You can wedge these down into the grooves, just a couple on each side of the frame, and this is going to keep the panel from rattling around, and the rubber's going to give way just enough so that the panel can expand when it wants to. Another pro tip is to pre-finish the center panel before you glue up the door. That way when the panel contracts, you won't get any hairline gaps where there was no paint or stain applied. The assembly goes exactly like it did for the shaker door example, just glue and clamps. And because of the coping, the frame parts only go together one way, so you can't really screw that up. But remember to put the center panel in facing the right direction, because there's no coming back from that mistake. Be a little stingy with the glue on this, and if you do get any squeeze out in the corners or in the coping, remove that now with a wet towel. It's very difficult to deal with during sanding, especially around all those delicate little details. Alright, that's 3 different doors for different skill levels built with different tools, but hey, these really aren't worth anything if you don't install them or build them the right size. So sizing your door actually comes down to a couple different factors, and which of these you choose really just depends on your style and preferences. The first is what type of door you want, either inset or overlay. If you want inset, well then the size of the door is pretty much defined by the inside opening of the cabinet, subtracting any reveal you want between the door and the frame. The most common reveal would be 1/8 of an inch, so just measure the cabinet opening and subtract 1/8 of an inch from all sides, and that's the size of your door. And the other option is an overlay door, which just means the door sits on top of the face of the cabinet instead of inside it. And for overlays, there's 2 options. There's full and partial. Full overlay means the door covers the entire face of the cabinet, so just measure the full distance from edge to edge, and that's the size your door will be. Partial overlay just means that the edge of the door only covers a portion of the face of the cabinet. For example, a 1/2 inch overlay will only cover the first 1/2 inch of the face. So if you're building a slab door, just take the height and the width and you're good to go. But if you're making a frame and panel door, we need to use that information to calculate the dimensions for the stiles, rails, and the center panel. Since the stiles always go the full length of the door, then the length is equal to the height of the door. That's easy, but with the rails, there's a little bit more math. So to start, take the total width of the door and subtract the width of each stile. But then you need to add back the length of the tongue, and that will give you the total length of your rails. To calculate the center panel, measure the height and width of the inside of the frame, and then add the depth of the grooves around each of the sides that the panel will be floating in. And if your center panel is MDF or plywood, you're good to go. But if you're making it out of solid wood, remember wood movement and remove an additional 1/4 of an inch. And as far as how wide you make your frame parts, that's really kind of subjective. It depends on the look you're going for as well as how big the door is. But a good place to start is 2 inches, and then you can go from there. To install your door, you're going to need hinges, and I could do a whole video on all the different hinges that are out there for you to use, but to save your sanity and mine, I'm going to stick to the most common hinge used in cabinets today, and that is the Euro style or concealed hinge. Unlike your kitchen cabinets from the 90s, these hinges can't be seen from the outside, leaving a clean, modern look. These hinges typically come in 2 parts, the cup side, which recesses into the door, and the plate side, which attaches to the cabinet. And 90% of choosing the right hinge for your project actually comes down to knowing just 2 things. First, the type of door, that's that inset, partial, or full overlay. And then, does your cabinet have a face frame or is it frameless? Then you can make your life 10,000 times easier and go to cabinetparts.com and use their hinge selection tool. Trust me, just do it. It's going to walk you through step by step until you've narrowed down your hinge choices to the ones that will fit your application. Then you can fine tune it by choosing secondary non-critical features like if you want soft close hinges or what angle the door will open to. I'm not associated with cabinetparts.com in any way. I'm not paid to say anything about them. I don't even make commissions. I just happen to think this tool is really awesome, and if you did want to pay them back for making such an awesome tool, give them some love. Okay, once you've got the correct hinges, you got to get them installed. I do this by starting with the door side of the hinge first. Get yourself one of these jigs. There are many like it, but this one is mine. This jig's going to help you drill the pocket that the hinge cup's going to sit in. But before you drill that hole, you need to know 2 things to place it correctly. The first is called the tab distance. All that really means is the distance from the edge of the door to the edge of the hinge. And you're going to get that measurement on the little instruction sheet that comes with your hinges, but I messaged Bloom and they sent me their entire catalog, so I've got all the information I need right here. And you can set that value right here on your jig. Then you need to know how far from the top and the bottom of the door you want to be. As far as I know, there's not a right answer to this question, but what I've found is starting at 3 inches in from either end of the door is a good place to start. I use a whole number here because it makes finding out where that hinge plate location goes a little bit easier. One thing to consider here is what else will be in the cabinet, like a pull-out tray. You want to make sure to place your hinges far enough in so that they're not going to interfere with the tray when you try to pull it out. Don't ask me how I know that. Another nice thing is you can use this jig to drill the pilot holes for the screws. And you'll see when you're done, the hinge is just going to drop right in that hole, and the pilot holes should line up with the holes in the hinge. That way you know you're all squared up. Now for the biggest challenge of all, with the door side done, how do we get these little plates set up in the cabinet so that everything lines up? That's not that hard, especially with the help of a couple small tools. Your hinge plate's going to have an offset value in the instructions. You can get little jigs like this one which give you that perfect offset from the front of the cabinet, but you still have to figure out how high to put that plate. But I have a different way of doing this that I think is much easier. Here, let me show you. Use a ruler with a stop on it and then set the distance to the offset value. Then mark a line on the inside of the cabinet in the rough area where both hinges should go. Next, get yourself one of these door positioner jigs. They're pretty cheap and make this so much easier. It clamps onto the cabinet and then you can set this little platform to match where you want the bottom of the door to be. Then add the hinge plates to the door side hinges, set your door on the little ledge, and line the screw holes up with those lines that you drew on the inside of the cabinet. That's going to be where you drill your pilot holes. Now your hinge plates are guaranteed to be in the exact right position and the door is going to open perfectly. How easy was that? And don't worry if you didn't get the positioning of the door exactly right when you installed it, because these hinges have all kinds of adjustments. You can go up, down, left, right, and even how far away from the cabinet the door sits. And all that's going to give you the perfect reveal. And that's all I know about doors. Thanks for watching.